from deploying nuclear-tipped missiles across the globe, inciting popular protests in many countries, and supporting dictator regimes across Latin America. The United States has almost everywhere interfered in the matters of another country. But why does any country for that matter poke its nose around into the matters of another country? To understand this, we have to go back in time. Back in 1945, when the world got divided into two different halves after the end of World War, these two halves were represented by two superpowers of the era. First was the United States, which was responsible for control of the Western Hemisphere, whereas on the other hand, the Eastern Hemisphere came to be represented by USSR or the Soviet Russia. Now, there's a concept in political theory or political science called as sovereignty, which in very basic terms means that a sovereign nation would have an absolute control over its domestic territory and policies, whereas being free from any kind of a foreign control or interference. However, this is the theory of political science, whereas in practice, the relationship between two countries for that matter is not determined by the concepts of political science, rather it is determined by the power differential between two nations. For example, if a greater power is undertaking its relationship with a smaller power, the relationship is not that of an equal. Rather, there will be a greater power and the smaller power. Similarly, we saw the US's relationship with other countries from 1945 onwards was that of a relationship between two siblings, where the elder sibling would eventually end up bossing around his or her younger siblings, leading to a difference in their relationship. And this difference in relationships between US and its allies resulted into US's attempt in interfering over the domestic matters of other countries. For example, as I told you, back in 1945 and onwards, the world came to be divided into two different halves. At one end was the US and the other end was Soviet Russia. Now, Soviet Russia, trying to achieve a power status with US, it developed and deployed the nuclear missiles of its own. And this puts America's interest over the European region into threat. So like every other country taking care of its own interest, US wanted to deploy its nuclear weapons or its arsenal on the territories of European nations. And as a result, from then onwards till now, we see that the United States of America has deployed its military arsenal or the nuclear-tipped missiles in many European nations like Netherlands, Germany, Italy, Turkey, etc. And this highlights how US started to interfere in the matters of national security, in the matters of territorial integrity of the continent in Europe. However, America's interference was not just limited to Europe, and as a result, it extended almost everywhere in the globe. For example, in 1973, US faced an oil crisis, and this oil crisis meant that the prices of oil in US, it skyrocketed. So cognizant of this vulnerability that US might face in future of a similar crisis, US, what it started to do is that it mollycoddled with the dictators of the Middle Eastern region, the region which had a huge surplus of crude oil deposits. From the image behind me, you can see that the US president of the time, Mr. Jimmy Carter, was sharing an alcohol with then Reza Pahlavi, who was the Shah of Iran. Now this highlighted how a close relationship between US and the dictatorships of Middle East, it emerged. And as a result, US started to interfere in the matters of Middle East, that it tried to quell the popular protest in the region. And this policy of US, as we came to understand in next decade or so, it backfired quite immensely. For example, in 1975 or 1979 for that matter, frustrated by the cause of concern at the time of Reza Pahlavi's rule in Iran, Islamic Revolution occurred in 1979, and as a result of Islamic Revolution, it also led to capturing of many US-based diplomats after the Tehran embassy of US was overrun by the rebels of Iran. So you'd understand any country would learn from its mistakes in Middle East. But this thing, it did not change. Because in 2003, we saw US also intervened in then Iraq. Because Iraq at the time, it was ruled by a dictator called Saddam Hussein, And US alleged that Saddam Hussein and its regime was maintaining and keeping a huge stockpile of weapons of mass destruction. However, this claim of US, as we came to know, was made on fictitious grounds. And this created a whole lot of furor across the world that US, under the garb of protecting the world from weapons of mass destruction, took care of its own interest in the region so as to secure the supplies of crude oil. Now, this interference by US, particularly in the Middle Eastern region, it prevailed. And from 2003 coming to 2025 today, we saw that America now, particularly the American businesses who are seen quite close to the ruling dispensation, that is Elon Musk, he started to interfere in the affairs of United Kingdom. As we saw in the previous video, there's a problem of grooming gangs in the UK, the gangs of men who try to sexually harass and traffic women as young as age 11. However, it came to attention in the public media that these grooming gangs are primarily led by people of Pakistani origin, which means this is not just a matter of UK's own citizens, but it is also related to the matters of immigrants coming into US or UK for that matter and becoming engrossed or involved in criminal activities in the UK. Now, the cause of concern of Elon Musk as far as grooming gangs were concerned was not related to the matters of public order and public safety in UK. Rather, he was more concerned that these immigrants, they were coming into developed countries like UK and US, and then they gotten themselves involved into anti-social and criminal activities. So, on the larger scale, this issue raised by Elon Musk was an example or a movement against anti-immigration. That is, any country for that matter which is a developed country wants to have certain anti-immigration policies which will prevent immigrants from entering into their own country and getting involved into antisocial and criminal activities. Now, you think this kind of an interference, or India for that matter, is immune from such interference, and if you think so, your premonition or your assumption is quite wrong. And why? Let me tell you that with certain examples. For instance, you must have heard about 1971 war when India intervened in then eastern Pakistan so as to prevent the human rights violation which was committed by Pakistani army on the population which was primarily Bengali speaking. And to prevent India from intervening militarily or dividing Pakistan, US announced the deployment of its 7th fleet of aircraft carriers. And this decision by US to prevent India from decidingly intervening in the Bangladeshi territory was seen as an instance of interference in India's own domestic and neighboring matters. As India, it was facing the brunt of illegal immigrants who were emerging from Bangladesh, and it created lots of social and economic pressures of India. And after Pakistan declared its war on India, India was forced to respond in kind by attacking Pakistani positions in the west and in the east, particularly in Bangladesh. And we saw, as a result of India's involvement in the war, the East Pakistan liberated itself and became Bangladesh that we know today. Now, these are the examples at how even in the past US has intervened in India's affair, which can be concerned with India's own territory or the matters in India's neighborhood. Now, back in 1991, when India was facing economic crisis, that was a severe balance of payment crisis, US, it intervened not directly but through its own body called as International Monetary Fund. As back then and even today, International Monetary Fund comes to be dominated by people of United States. And when India approached the IMF for emergency financing and loans, the IMF, they impose certain kind of conditionalities, saying that the IMF has no problem in providing loans to India, provided that India takes certain kind of reforms and measures to quell the economic crisis. And it included making the markets of India more open to global trade, selling off the assets of public sector undertakings, and also undertaking a huge depreciation of its own currency to promote foreign trade. So this is how a domestic crisis which was economic in nature, especially with respect to India, And even in these domestic crises, US decided to impose conditionalities on India, which is an example of US's interference in India's domestic matters. Also, at the time, back in 1974 and 1998, when India conducted the test of its own nuclear weapons in an underground facility in Pokhran, Rajasthan, it pissed off US by great amounts. And as a result, to counter India's development of nuclear weapons, US imposed several sanctions on India's participation in nuclear trade and India's participation in transfer of technology with respect to many other things. And this is how India's own security interests, which promoted India to develop a nuclear weapon of its own, became a cause of concern not for India but for another country located quite far off, that was United States. As United States did not want any other country except the 5 original powers to develop their own nuclear weapons. And as a result, US imposed several sanctions, which you can understand is an instance of interference in India's own security matters. Now you'd think after the passage of 2005 Indo-US civil nuclear deal, these kind of interference would have come to an end. Again, you'll be incorrect. Why am I saying this? Because back when President Obama came into power, the cause of concern of America's intervention became the issue of human rights. That whenever India was witnessing popular protests by its own citizens against its own government, it became a cause of concern for US that no, India was not providing enough human rights to its own citizens. Or rather, it is denying the very people of minority communities living in India their own promised constitutional right. Now, why would any country or any other country poke its nose in the internal matters of India, which particularly involves India's own citizens, and they are raising grievances against India's own democratically elected government? So theoretically, it's not a matter of concern for any country, right? But in practice, we have seen global powers like US interfere in our own domestic matters, particularly when it relates to the matters of human rights as well as constitutional rights. Now, this has been a history with US, that it has poken its nose around not just with respect to India, but with other countries also. Now, President Trump is now coming into power from 20th January onwards, and this coming of President Trump has well received by India's political thinkers as well as Indian media. So you'd think naturally that whenever President Trump is coming to power, who is seen as somewhat cognizant and considerate of India's security interests, he would not interfere in matters of India from now on. But again, you couldn't be any more wrong. Because back when he was in power from 2016 to 2020, we saw that the Trump administration severely poked its nose around, particularly with India's decision to impose tariffs on import of other goods. Trump's cause of concern back then was that India was imposing tariff on import of motorcycles, particularly those motorcycles that were manufactured in US called as Harley Davidson. And it was Trump's decision or request from India so that it reduce the level of tariffs on its motorcycles, and so that it will promote trade between these two countries, particularly involving the Harley Davidson motorcycle. So naturally, extending this to his current term, you'd expect President Trump and his administration, particularly when Elon Musk, who is also the owner of Tesla, is quite close politically with President Trump, that he'll demand similar lift of tariff and reduction in tariff when it comes to import of electric vehicles like Tesla cars. Because India, on one hand, it wants to promote domestic manufacturing of EVs in India. And this goes against the very demand of President Trump of reducing the import tariffs on foreign-made cars, especially the cars belonging to Tesla company. So this is how in coming future, in the next 4 years for that matter, you can expect the decisions of Trump administration to interfere in India from economic point of view. As earlier we have seen in our discussion, the intention of American administrations, particularly with respect to democratic parties, they were more inclined to impose restrictions and interfere when it came to political matters. But on the other hand, Mr. Trump is very different. Coming from a business-related background, his primarily cause of concern is to increase and enhance America's economic interest across the world, including India. And from this very background, you can expect President Trump to impose and demand several economic-related concessions from India so that it promotes American interest in Indian country. But on the other hand, you'll also have to understand that Indian government, being sovereign, that it has absolute control over its own territory, will not budge around with such unfair demands by the Republican administration, particularly from President Trump. So this was all for today's discussion on the American intervention, its history and its pattern in India. Stay tuned for more such videos on a issue-based topic.